For those of you who don't know, he was one of the the American quality gurus that was shipped over to Japan after the Second World War to help turn around Japanese manufacturing sector. And that's just one of his great quotes. I'm an avid collector of quotes. You'll probably see a few more pop up as we go through the course of the presentation this morning. So agenda-wise, want to talk through these topics, understanding what quantitative data is and when to use it, sources of data, basic analysis techniques to help you describe your data, pictorial descriptions of data, so essential graphs and charts, potential pitfalls, and we'll be looking at sampling and trying to understand how much data is enough when you're collecting data, and then decision making, using data to support decision making. I've also got some workshop notes that I will make available for Angela to share with you after the workshop, and that will also be available on my SlideShare channel. So if you want to look me up on slideshare.net, it's Ian Seath, and there's a whole load of these presentations from previous learning labs and various other workshops that I've run for clients and other organizations as well. In terms of me and my background, I'm currently a trustee of a very small charity called Dachshund Health UK, which you may have guessed from the picture of the dachshund in the background and the fact that there will be barking as we go through this presentation at some point, no doubt. That's a very small charity. We basically do research, education and health improvement activities for the dachshund breed. I'm also a non-exec director for the Kennel Club, which is the UK's largest canine welfare organisation. And I'm a steering group member for pro bono operational research. And if any of you are interested, I put a slide together at the end of this pack, which tells you a little bit more about operational research pro bono. If you have some projects that need consultancy support, we have a team of people who are desperately in need of working with charities. We've got more volunteers than we've got charities with projects. So if you've got a load of numbers that need crunching, if you need help with analytics or strategy development and systems analysis, we've got people, we've got a pool of volunteers that'd be more than happy to work with you. So the contact details and the information will be on the final slide. And I've worked with third sector organizations since about 2004 in a mix of pro bono work and paid consulting work. My background originally was in the manufacturing sector. I'm a chemistry graduate, but I've also got an HR postgraduate qualification, and I've worked in probably most functions apart from finance and engineering. I've never worked in the public sector, but I've got a lot of public sector clients as well. So that's pretty much me. We're moving to the first session around understanding what quantitative data is and when to use it. And I think broadly there are three reasons that you might want to use data. And we'll be touching on really just the first of these as we go through this workshop today. So descriptive statistics, some of you may have come across the term descriptive statistics, describing what we've got at the moment or analysing historical data. The second approach is really looking to say, can we predict the future or forecast the future based on past trends? And often that would be referred to as predictive analytics and predictive analytic modelling. And then in the face of uncertainty, which I guess a lot of us have been through over the last 12 months, modelling, and everybody will be familiar with Chris Whitty and Valence and all the various models that have appeared on our TV screens over the last 12 months. So just in terms of reflecting on the last 12 months, descriptive statistics, you see loads of pie charts and graphs demonstrating where we're at the moment in terms of cases, deaths, whatever. That's descriptive statistics. We probably haven't seen an awful lot of the trend analysis. The second chart in the middle of the screen there is historical mortality data from the UK, and you can start looking at trend lines and seasonality. So that's the sort of predictive based on trends and historical data. And then the modelling, the chart at the bottom is, I think, was it the 31st of October when Chris Whitty shared some charts of models of what might happen through the pandemic. and there's various universities, Imperial and Warwick and so on, that are doing modelling. So trying to look at what might happen in situations of uncertainty. I'm not going to talk about modelling at all today, but again, that's one of the sort of approaches that if you have a need to model conditions of uncertainty, some of our pro bono operational research volunteers would be really skilled to do that with you. I know that Angela runs learning labs on qualitative data analysis. At the end of the day, ultimately, all data are quantitative. So Angela's workshops or learning labs are focused around things like focus groups, interviews, and more of those softer qualitative approaches to gathering data. Once you've got the data, you still need to do some number crunching. So apologies, Angela. I'm going to say it doesn't really matter whether it's qual or quant. It's all data and it's all quant at the end of the day. We're going to run the first poll now. So Angela, if I could ask you to pop that up, please, and for people just to give us a view of what your quantitative data challenges are as you see them at the moment.
For some reason, I can't see any responses, so I don't know. Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes, we're starting to get some response.
Yeah,
Probably
okay, great.
people taking a bit of time to read.
I was thinking because the last learning lab, I had a problem with one of the polls, but it's looking good. Great. So we've got 12 people have voted, just a couple more moments, and then I'll share the results.
Comment from Sam saying she wanted to select all of them.
Yeah.
We'll set up a special therapy session for anybody who wants to vote for all of them after the workshop.
Just a couple more people missing. But I think I'll just share the results.
Okay, can everybody see that on the shared screen? Everybody see the results? Okay, so top two, we don't know what data we should collect, and we don't know how best to analyse the data that we've got already. Hopefully we will answer both of those as we go through the course of this morning. Don't know how best to present our data, so that probably means you're familiar with graphs and charts. Don't have the right tools or IT to make use of the data. I will be touching on some of the IT and tools that are available. Obviously Excel, probably people are pretty familiar with, but there are some add-ins for Excel that might be of use to you as well. We don't know how to use the data to improve our performance. We'll touch on that briefly in the workshop. And interestingly, not enough people are interested in using our data. So actually, that's quite an interesting observation, really. I think quite a lot of the challenges around data are cultural, whether people want to use it, how they use it, and potentially unintended consequences of setting things like targets and objectives and league tables, which I know the public sector is riddled with, probably less so in the voluntary sector. Right, can we hide that, Angela, please? First framework to share with you, if you want some really good resources around understanding where your organisation is in terms of use of data and thinking about data, Data Orchard have a data maturity model, and you can go on their website. The link is at the bottom of the slide there, and you can assess your organization's maturity in terms of whether you've got the skills, the tools, the culture, the leadership. I won't read all those bubbles on the left-hand side, but that's a really useful starting point. There's a quick and dirty version of that self-assessment, and there's a more detailed version of that self-assessment as well. And I know probably Angela and Antonia can probably talk to that in more detail if people would like to have some further input on that one. But it's a really useful resource on the Data Orchard website.
Just to jump in, we actually ran a session last week on this framework with DataKind, so we can share, we'll publish the recording of that on YouTube, which you can catch up on, and I'll share the link here as well.
Good, thank you. And from inspiringimpact.org, which is another great website if you've not come across that, they talk about 5 main uses of data. First of all, user data, so the characteristics of the people that are using your service, your beneficiaries, for example. Engagement data, how they're using your service and the extent to which they use it would be a second potential use of data. Thirdly, feedback from not just beneficiaries, but potentially from volunteers that are working with your organization, information on what they think about the service, the way it's been delivered. The challenge starts to get into areas, I guess, around outcomes data, information on short-term changes, behavioral changes, benefits that people have got from your service. And I suspect some of you probably will have theories of change models. And again, I know that Measuring the Good have run various sessions on theories of change and impact measurement. So outcomes data and impact data are those 2 top levels in most theory of change models. So the impact data, long-term difference that it's resulted from the service. So those are your broad uses of data. Excuse my dogs in the background. Why can't I move the slide? If I move on to the second topic, thinking around where can we get data and how can we go about collecting it. My second favorite set of quotes around data and measurement, the golden rules of measurement: no measurement without recording, no recording without analysis, and no analysis without action. So don't dream up a metric or a measurement if you've got no way of gathering the data. Don't bother gathering the data if you don't intend to do any analysis, and don't bother wasting your time reporting it and analyzing it unless you intend to take some action. And I suspect if you reflect on the amount of data that you gather, analyze and report, you might have some interesting views on to what extent do they enable you to drive any action. The other point I'd make about these 3 bullets here is that they work the other way around as well. So I come from a consulting world about change management and continuous improvement. You shouldn't be taking action without analysis of really good data. So the 3 bullets work the opposite way as well. No action without analysis of really good data. And that really leads us into thinking about where might we get data from. And I'm going to go back to that Inspiring Impact 5 types of data and talk a little bit about data sources associated with each of those 5 types. So user data, some of you may well have customer relationship management systems, CRM systems. I work with a couple of consultancies that implement Salesforce.com as a CRM system, particularly in the voluntary sector. Zoho is another CRM system that's out there, and I know there are a whole host of others. So clearly there's a ton of user data available to you from your CRM system if you have those, or from mailing lists if you're using tools like MailChimp, which is my personal favorite newsletter email system. Engagement data, if you're using booking systems for events like Eventbrite, clearly there's engagement data that you can get through that. And similarly with finance systems that you have where you're tracking payments, receipts, grants, donations as well. So inevitably IT systems give you multiple sources of user data and engagement data. When we start thinking about feedback data, the familiar tools, probably things like SurveyMonkey. There is obviously a free version of that. It's very, very limited, and personally, I don't ever recommend it to anything. My favorite tool at the moment is Google Forms. So if you have access to Google accounts, you can set up really quite sophisticated surveys in Google Forms. It's completely free. And similarly, Microsoft Forms is also, if you've got most people will have a Microsoft account, Microsoft Forms will let you set up surveys as well. The great thing about Google and Microsoft Forms, you can dump the data straight into an Excel spreadsheet if you want to analyze it in Excel. Google, you could, if you're a Google user, you can do your analysis using Google Sheets as well. So definitely my vote for my go-to survey tool at the moment is Google Forms. Presentation tools, if you're running workshops, sessionars, hosting events, there's a couple of great tools. One is called Mentimeter and the other is Poll Everywhere. Both of those enable you to create slides to capture live feedback. So typically if I'm running a workshop, I would use something like Mentimeter. You can put a slide up partway through a session and just ask people for quotes on how are they feeling about the workshop. And it will either display it on the screen as those individual quotes, or you can build word clouds. So it's a really good way of just getting some quick and dirty feedback if you're running events. Poll Everywhere, again, there is a free version of that. It puts an add-in into PowerPoint. You can run it with audiences of up to 25 people with the free account. If you want to use with a larger audience than that, you need to go for the paid for account. Mentimeter, there is a free version. There's no limit on the number of people that you can have in your audience, but it limits you to having 2 slides in a presentation. But there's nothing to stop you having more than 1 presentation per event that you're doing. So those are 2 really useful tools. Typically with both of those, people would respond using a mobile phone. So you share a screen with them with what do you think about the session so far? There's a code that they type into their smartphone, and then they can respond on a smartphone, and it collates all the results, and you can share that with them. So those are my 2 favorite feedback gathering tools for live events and live workshops. Outcomes data, clearly there's all sorts of survey tools, focus groups, interviews, and Angela's Learning Lab on qualitative data gathering and data analysis. If you've not attended that, that's definitely a go-to event to find out more about that. Impact data, obviously published statistics. We're seeing tons and tons of statistics from the ONS and Public Health England and so on associated with the pandemic, but they have a raft of other data and statistics, local authority data as well. And some of you may, maybe in the larger charities, research projects and research studies that are fairly robust in terms of gathering impact data. So multiple sources and a range of potential tools that you may already be familiar with, and some of those I guess may be new to you as well. The other point I'd probably make is don't underestimate the availability of some really simple tools for data gathering. So good old check sheets and tally sheets on the top left of this slide, the old 5-bar gate where we're notching up how many of these in January, February, March, April, and then obviously turn it into a spreadsheet and do your graphs and charts coming out of that. So if you're slogging through paper feedback forms, you could use something like a tally sheet. Concentration diagram. This is the really famous John Snow Broad Street pump cholera outbreak map. So a concentration diagram is, as in this example, a map, a location plan, and you put a cross or put a dot on the plan where there was a cholera outbreak. It's the sort of thing you see on all the crime series, the map where, you know, where did people get bumped off, where did the accidents happen? Again, if you're thinking about whereabouts do your beneficiaries come from, if you're working in a city, you could do a concentration diagram of whereabouts are people located compared with where do you actually deliver your services, for example. When I worked in manufacturing, we used concentration diagrams for health and safety analysis. Whereabouts in the factory did people hurt themselves? Put a cross on the plan, and then you build up a concentration of where are the defects or where are the faults or where are the accidents. So if you're interested in location-based data, something like a concentration diagram could be a really simple tool. Feedback emojis, those of us that used to go through airports, if you remember Heathrow Airport, once you get through security, they have an electronic emoji box. You can do was security great, average or awful for you? One of my third sector clients, they again, pre-pandemic, running social events for elderly people in coffee shops, flip chart with three of those emojis on the flip chart. People just put in a tick against which one they felt at the end of the session that they had with them. And if you're running online workshops, or well, even face-to-face workshops, good old dot voting, giving people 3 votes, 3 dots to vote on sticky post-its. I don't know whether any of you have transitioned to online workshops for any of your events. I'm using a whiteboarding tool called Miro, M-I-R-O. There are loads of whiteboarding tools, but Miro is a really great one. There's a free version which lets you play around with it. And you can give people sticky post-it notes. They can do voting. You can do all sorts of interesting stuff in Miro as a whiteboard. The other free ones that are around that I do come across is Google Jamboard. So again, if any of you are Google-based organizations, Jamboard is a fairly good online whiteboard tool, and Microsoft Whiteboard, which is a bit average, but if you're using Microsoft Teams, that might be a tool that's of use to you as well. So thinking about simple data collection tools like dot voting. Okay, let me move on to analysis techniques to help you describe your data. So we've been sat here for about 20 minutes. You've had a poll. Antonia knows what's coming next. This is audience participation time. Antonia's got a broad grin on her face. Sorry about this, folks. Right. Question for you. An aeroplane flies round the 4 100-mile sides of a square. It flies at 100 miles an hour on side 1, 200 miles an hour on side 2, 300 on 3, 400 on side 4. What is its average speed? Put your answer in the chat window.
I think people are getting the calculators out.
Ooh, I don't mind if you get. You don't. Yeah,
I thought
if you
we'd
want to use
finished
a calculator.
homeschooling.
You just randomly come up with a number if that's the easiest way to do it.
200, 250 with a couple of question marks. There's a lot of 250s.
A lot of 250s. A lot of 250s.
Yes.
There's a 200. I didn't warn you there would be maths. You would have turned up if I'd warned you there was going to be maths. It's not even maths, it's just arithmetic. 1,000 divided by 4, which would be the 250 answer. Somebody clearly doesn't trust me because they put 250, but guess this is wrong. All right, thank you very much. Clearly built a load of trust already in the workshop this morning. I know there'll be a trick question. Thank you, Sarah. Any more for any more? This is quite cruel. Right, let me put you out of your misery. The answer is 192. What people typically do is add up the numbers, come to 1,000, divide by 4 because there's 4 sides of the square, and end up with the 250 answer. If you think about it, what's going on here, we've got an aeroplane that's flying across the first 100 miles at 100 miles an hour. So that's 1 hour to fly across there. It takes it half an hour to fly down the second side at 200 miles an hour. It takes a third of an hour to fly across the third side, and it takes a quarter of an hour to fly up the fourth side. So the time taken to fly around the square is 1 plus a half plus a third plus a quarter, which is 2.08 hours. If you divide 400 by 2.08, you come up with this randomly odd 192 miles an hour. Why do you think people very rarely get that exercise right? Anybody like to come off mute?
Because I'm really old and it's a long time since I've done maths.
Right.
That was going to be my answer.
Playing the age card, Shona. Yeah, okay.
Sticking with it as well.
Let's bounce that to some of the younger people in the audience and whether they have an alternative perspective on that one. Other folks, why do you think people typically get that wrong?
Just think people take the easier option. What's easier to understand?
Yeah. It looks like there's an obvious answer to it. There is an obvious answer to it, but it's obviously wrong. Any other views? I don't even understand it when you've explained it. All right, okay. Yeah. So let me see whether I can. Let me see if I can. Can I annotate? I probably can annotate the slide, can't I?
Is it partly the question as well?
The way it's phrased.
Because you could argue that technically the average speed of all of those speeds is correct at 250, couldn't you? But what you miss in that question is that this is a real world example.
And what we're trying to understand is, yes, is the whole picture, not, yeah. So you could say the average speed, if you just did a simplistic average on it, is add them up and divide by 4. Yeah. But it's a flawed way of doing it. So if I just put the other answers in here, it's half an hour round that side. It's 0.33 of an hour round that side, and it's 0.25 of an hour on that side. And if you add up 1 plus 0.5 plus 0.33 plus 0.25, that is 2.08 hours. The plane has flown 400 miles. 400 divided by 2.08 equals 192. So it's the total distance traveled divided by the time it took to travel it. And we often look at numbers and don't think about exactly what you're saying there, what's going on in the real world, what is really happening in the world. And it's really easy to leap to conclusions and calculate useless, come up with useless conclusions.
And also sometimes not to be really clear about what's the question we're trying to answer.
What's the question we're trying to answer? Yes, what are we trying to find out at the end of it? Acceleration. Oh yes, we've probably got a physicist in the room. In reality, we would also need to take into account acceleration, because it doesn't spontaneously go from 100 to 200 and 200 to 300. That's the first time I've ever done that exercise and anybody's mentioned acceleration. So well done, brownie points for acceleration and
Sorry, that was me. I'm also a maths teacher.
Oh, yeah. All right. Oh, well done. Oh, why are you here this morning then? You should be leading this. Thanks, Steph. Right, let me just clear all of that lot. Okay. So Steph will recognize and be really good at the next part of the workshop. Was it Disraeli said something about lies, damned lies, and statistics? We can almost come up with whatever answer you want, depending on how you crunch the numbers and the tools that you use to do it. And my picture that illustrates the misleading average is this rock climbing example. the climber at the top saying on average our rope is 2 centimeters thick. And then if you actually look at the rope, what's going on, we've got a thick bit of rope, a very thin bit of rope, and a thick bit of rope. So the average is not a desperately helpful concept in that context. So more sums for you. Do we know what average means? So the length of time it takes in days to process 10 grant applications was recorded. Those are the 10 grant applications. Those are the number of days that it took to do it. What was the average time it took? Those of you that have got calculators in front of you will be able to do this really, really quickly. So when somebody comes up with an answer, type it in the chat box. Steph, have you cracked it?
Over to you, Steph.
Yeah, the mean is 8. Well done, Steph. Obviously, Wizzy and somebody else got 8 question mark, another 8 question mark. Yeah, so that's the average that everybody is absolutely familiar with, isn't it? You know, add the numbers up, divide by the numbers of the number of numbers, and you come out with what is conventionally known as the average, but is actually technically the arithmetic mean. So sum of the values, divide by the number of values, and in that case it's 8. But there are 2 other sorts of average that you might calculate as well. And the median is the second average. Those of you that maybe looked at pay data, often the median is quoted. So the median is the middle value when you stack the numbers up in order from smallest to biggest. So in this case, we run from 6 all the way up to 13, and the middle value in this case is between 7 and 7.5. So if we've got an even number, we take the average of those 2 midpoints, and it's 7.25. So that's a lower average than the arithmetic mean. And then the mode is a third way of calculating the average, which is the most frequently occurring example. And in this case, we have 3 lots of 7, so the mode is 7. So depending on what lies, damned lies and statistics you want to tell and what stories you want to tell, you might choose whether to use the mean, the median, or the mode. If you've got distributions of data that are fairly symmetrical, and I'll talk about that in a minute, then the median and the mean are typically the same or very similar. If you have skewed data, then you may need to think about whether the mean is actually an appropriate way of calculating the average. So let me ask you another question. We have 2 distributions here. These are charts showing how long it takes to respond to a grant application, process a grant application. In the left-hand example, scenario A, we've got a long-tailed distribution. And in scenario B, we have a fairly symmetrical distribution. Let's start with the long-tailed one. Who'd like to shout out which of the averages you think you'd use for that, other than Steph? N equals 33. What does N equals 33 mean? There were 33 grant applications. So this is a sample of 33. Which of the means would be most appropriate for the long-tailed distribution?
Would it be the mode?
No. So you've down to 2 more, George. You could use the mode. Actually, that is an interesting point. Why would you choose the mode, George?
So in terms of like kind of what the most common number is, there's quite a lot that have said 10. And I was just thinking if you were to do the mean, you've got sort of what, 10 people, 10 people at one, and then all the others sort of by the time you get to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, they're actually quite low. So if you were to do an average, it'd probably bring the average up and not be that representative of actually how long it would take.
Yeah, the best average, or the most useful average, is actually the median, because of the shape of the distribution. If you wanted to look really good, you'd use the mode. You tell everybody that your average response time was 1 day, which is the mode, which has the highest frequency. But that is a complete distortion of the actual performance. So the median is probably more important. And on the right-hand example, you probably want to use the mean, because it's a fairly symmetrical distribution. And if you do those calculations, the mean for the chart on the left is 3.6, whereas the median is 3, because it's got that long tail. And the mean on the right-hand chart is 4.7, and the median is 5. Very little difference between the two of those, but being a symmetrical distribution, I would probably choose the mean for that one. So next question for you: which one of those two, the mean or the median, would you want to be, or sorry, which one of those two distributions would you want to be held accountable for managing if you were in charge of grant application process? Shout out. Or maybe you wouldn't want to be held accountable for either of them.
I don't know. Would it be A again, just because it's you're getting it's a shorter response time in general, and the majority are in one. So if you were to like examine the data and stuff, you'd be able to say actually majority we do get out quite quickly, but sometimes it does take us a bit longer.
So if you want to tell the story that by and large we get responses out really, really quickly, then you might go for the A one. Anybody want to argue the symmetrical one to be held accountable for, and why?
I was going to say the symmetrical one, because I was thinking you could be clearer in a way about how long it actually takes. There's not as many outliers, are there? So
yeah, I also, coming from a continuous improvement and statistical process control background, would go for the symmetrical one, because it is telling you what the typical spread of variation is. There isn't a long tail, and you can be confident that all the grants are processed between 2 and 8 days. So to me, that looks like a process that's more in control, because I've got that shape of distribution, that normal distribution, or that bell-shaped curve. Whereas I suspect the process that you're operating in on the left-hand side, sometimes we do a great job and sometimes we do a lousy job. And we probably aren't very confident about which grant applications are going to get processed quickly and which ones might drag out for weeks or days.
I was going to say A, just because A, you've got some clear outliers, so you can focus on what's causing those to take longer and try and solve for whatever that is.
John, that's a useful observation, because if I have got a distribution like the left-hand one, I would be wanting to understand what is it that causes the 8, 9, and 10-day response times, and you can do some root cause problem solving and try and address the root causes of that and sharpen up the performance in the process. So yeah, there probably isn't a right answer in terms of which ones you want to be held accountable for. You will have a level of performance in your organization, and you need to understand what the distribution's telling you. So my next challenging question for you: whereabouts would you set a service level agreement? If you were going to say to people, we will respond to grant applications within X days, whereabouts would you set your service level agreement?
You want to set it at the top end if you can, don't you?
So give me a number of days that you'd be putting in your service level agreement. We will process 95% of all grant applications within how many days? Anybody?
6.
6. Why do you go for 6?
Well, because I reckon you could get the majority, looking at both of them, you can get the majority done, and then you look at the process to see how you can improve that to make sure you get within that number. And it looks like a good, you don't want to say 10 days, that seems like a long time.
Yeah, so there's definitely with that long tail of outliers, you'd want to be understanding how to reduce that long tail. 6 days, if you set 6 days and you've got the right hand distribution, then you've got 3 out of 33 grant applications that would fall outside that specification limit, which is was about 10%, isn't it? So 90% would be done in time. Again, if you understand what the shape of the distribution is, it helps you think about where you might put your service level agreements and what's a sensible level of performance to claim that you want to try and strive for. And just back to tools to help you do this sort of stuff, good old Excel enables you to create histograms like you've seen on that previous chart. And the simple version of Excel, you can just use the bar chart graph tool. If you are interested in doing more analytical work, you've got the, where is it, the data analysis add-in pack for Excel, which gives you a whole load of other statistical analysis tools. It's a free download that you can stick in Excel. You tell it where your data input range is on your spreadsheet. You create what are called bins for the size of the boxes in your histogram, and you can tell it to create a chart output, and it creates a histogram chart for you. So the data add-in or the data analysis add-in for Excel is a really useful tool to make it easier to do histograms and distribution plots of data that you've got going on. When you've got your data plotted as a histogram, and I suspect lots of people don't even bother going to plotting histograms, it starts to tell you something about what's going on in your processes. And you typically get, you know, various different shaped distributions. We've talked about bell-shaped, we've talked about skewed. What do you think might be going on if you get a histogram that's got 2 peaks or a plateau? What might that tell you about your source data? This is one for Steph, I suspect.
Sorry, could you just repeat the question?
So if you have, if you plot your histogram and you find you've got a bimodal distribution, so you've got 2 peaks, or you've got a plateau distribution where it's a broad peak in the middle, what might that be telling you about your source data? And what questions might you be asking about your source data if you saw those shaped distributions? Steph, is this one for you?
Well, I was looking at the bimodal and wondering whether it's because it's almost like having 2 separate sets of data.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's 2 different populations that have been chunked together, and you end up with 2 normal distributions. So we've got 2 completely different things going on in that data set, and you've probably got 2 sets of data as well in the plateau sample. So looking at the distribution and the shape of the distribution helps you think about what's going on in the real world in my data. Have I actually got a single population or a single sample, or have I got multiple samples that are chunked together when I'm looking at my data? I'm going to stop at that point and give us a a leg stretch opportunity for 5 minutes. Can I just have a bit of feedback on any learning or value or insights, or have I just freaked you out with maths or arithmetic this morning? Bit of feedback before we take a break would be appreciated. If anybody'd like to come off mute.
I think the way you're describing the data and stuff and everything, I think you're doing it. It's very accessible, because quite a lot of the time, I think when I don't know, when you go to like something like this to learn about data and things, sometimes it can be kind of unnecessarily complicated. But I think actually it's it's quite concise and it's really helpful and interesting.
Okay. As somebody said, a little freaked with the maths. I apologize for that, but yeah, okay. If it's not your thing, find a friend who can do it for you, or talk to Antonia about getting one of the volunteers from Measuring the Good, or come and talk to me and my colleagues at the OR Society, and we'd be really happy to help you set up tools to do the data gathering, do the analysis, and help you understand it. Any other final bits of feedback before we take a break for 5?
I've got a greater appreciation for the people in the organisation at the Dual Youth Project who do all this stuff. I'll be sending some thank you emails and potentially some chocolates after this.
Good. On a great recognition note. Thank you, Shona. Right, let's take a 5-minute leg stretch. Go and grab yourselves a cup of tea or coffee, and then we'll move into looking at data presentation approaches. Thank you. Charts. Most of them I'm sure you'll be pretty familiar with, so not really any great need to dwell on them. And again, Excel and Google Sheets have charting facilities that are fairly straightforward and fairly easy to use. So graphs and charts, if you've got more than 10 data points, show people a chart. If you've got tons and tons of data, you may need to have a supporting table in your reports or presentations as well. And if you're interested in showing performance over time, then clearly charts, line graphs are the tool to be using. Try and avoid the trap of putting too many data sets on an individual graph or chart. My pet hate chart is the pie chart. I just loathe them, but all sorts of people seem to love putting them into annual reports, for example, and it makes it even worse if you turn it into a 3D pie chart. They are just about useful for showing proportions, but I will move swiftly on from pie charts. Bar charts. So bar charts, typically one of 2 formats. There's the stacked bar chart if you've got multiple data sets, or the 100% stacked bar chart, both of which are tools that you can use from Excel. So if you're looking at quantities, they're no good for showing trends, but if you're looking at proportions and quantities of, in this case, project spending, for example, either a stacked bar chart or a 100% stacked bar chart. We've talked about histograms. So I don't think enough people draw histograms to show what the spread of data is in their data sets. So if you've got a lot of data over a period of time about what's going on in a process, response times, for example, or times to answer calls, the histogram has frequency up the left-hand axis and a variable on the horizontal axis. So a histogram is different to a bar chart. Bar charts have categories along the horizontal axis. Histograms have a variable on that horizontal axis. And the shape of the histogram, as we talked about, can be really interesting in terms of looking at what's going on in the population or in the data. So just be aware that Excel calls histograms bar charts. If you're using basic Excel, if you're using the data analysis add-in, there is the histogram function in that add-in. Another really underutilized charting tool is the Pareto chart or Pareto analysis. Some of you may have come across this as the 80-20 rule. Vilfredo Pareto was an economist, I think in the 18th century, looking at population and wealth. 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the population. I think if Pareto did his analysis these days, it would be something like the 97-3 rule rather than the 80-20 rule, with the amount of wealth owned by a very small number of people. So the Pareto principle and Pareto analysis is a great way of separating out the vital few from the trivial many. And very often what we find is that 80% of problems or errors or customers are associated with 20% of causes, for example. And the remaining 80% is known as the trivial many. The Pareto principle enables you to focus on a small number of things that give you a big amount of leverage. And an example might be if you're looking at sources of funding. So it's a type of bar chart. So it's a bar chart because it's got categorical data. It's got categories along the horizontal axis, and the unique characteristic of a Pareto diagram is that it's a bar chart with the categories in order of biggest down to smallest. So this is sources of funding ranked and stacked from biggest down to smallest. The Pareto piece is about understanding where is 80% of where does 80% of the data lie. So the left-hand axis is the amount of income from each of these different sources. The right-hand axis is cumulative percentage. So we have £240,000 of income from the National Lottery, which equates to about 47% of the total income. You then add the percentage of the second category from trusts and foundations, which takes us up to just over 70%. So what we're drawing is a cumulative frequency line. So by the time we've got all the sources of funding, that's 100% of the funds. That's the 100% of the funds that we've raised. And the Pareto principle would say 20% of the sources of funding give us 80% of the funds. So if we scroll across from 80%, we've actually got 3 categories. So it's about 30-70 rather than 80-20. But it's showing you where do you get your leverage. If you wanted to put more effort into a particular issue, what are the small number of aspects that would give you the big amount of leverage? So it's the sort of thing that if you've got customer complaints data, 80% of the complaints will be for 20% of the reasons for complaints. If you keep stocks of materials, for example, for your beneficiaries, 80% of the value of the stocks will be associated with 20% of the types of stock item. Small number of stock items account for a huge amount of the value that you have in your stores, for example. 80% of the funding comes from 20% of the donors, those sorts of situations. So Pareto analysis is a really great tool for focusing on where do we get the big leverage points. Sometimes if you're using Pareto analysis, it can be helpful to do a before and after. So if we do a campaign and it changes what happens, just comparing the Pareto diagram before and after. And if you're, for example, using it to address complaints performance, once you've knocked off some of the complaints, there'll be a different Pareto. There'll still be an 80-20 that sits in there. I come from the world of continuous improvement, so trend graphs and line graphs are real bread and butter to me. I'm really interested to see what's happening over a period of time. One of my other favorite quotes, 2 data points do not indicate a trend. So just because it's gone up or it's gone down doesn't mean there's a trend. And the other quote that I came across recently, the plural of anecdote is not data. All right, so we need to be understanding time series in order to be able to make judgments about whether things are improving or whether they're not improving. So the line graph typically is the tool that you're going to be using in order to understand trends over a period of time. Just be careful not to overlay too many lines on the same chart. And for those of you that are using Excel, you're able to put in a statistically derived trend line. So once you've plotted your line graph, if you right click on the data series, it will enable you to put a trend line in so you can smooth out what's going on over a period of time. So trend lines can be really useful to see what's going on as well. And Angela, I think I'm going to skip the second poll given where we are time-wise. So I'm just going to move on to how much data is enough and thinking a little bit about sampling, and then we'll move into questions. Anecdotes are not statistics. Often you won't be able to get every single beneficiary or every single donor or every single person who's been through an intervention or a program to respond and get feedback from. So you may need to think about setting up samples. The challenge is to think about how many people or what size of sample do I actually need in order for it to be a valid set of data. So they need to be representative, but it's also about the economics. You know, can we afford to do it, and can we do it quickly enough? I did some work with a housing association a few years back, and they had an approach to measuring satisfaction from their tenants for all the various services that they performed. And if they went out and asked every single tenant how happy they were, and if every single tenant responded, they may end up with something like a bell-shaped curve, normal distribution, with a range of satisfaction from unhappy to very happy. Clearly, they were never going to get every single tenant to respond, and they couldn't actually go out and speak to every single tenant or survey every single tenant. So one of the things that they did was they asked the contact center what were tenants' views of satisfaction. And the contact center spoke to 10 people, and they got that set of results. Your conclusion probably would be we've got lots of happy bunnies looking at that sample. They also decided that they would ask some of their volunteers who went out into the community and worked alongside some of those tenants. The volunteers gathered some data, and they asked 10 people, and that was the set of data that they got back. And you'd probably be coming up with a completely different perception of tenant satisfaction on the basis of that sample of 10. The point is, it's very easy to pick the wrong sample and draw the wrong conclusions. So what we need to do is decide on what is a valid sample size in order to be able to say, actually, we understand how happy people are and what their responses truly represent. So a sample of 10 picked in the wrong way clearly is unhelpful. There's a really useful sample size calculator tool online at www.surveysystem.com, and this is a tool that enables you to type in data about what's your population size and how confident you want to be about the results, and it will then tell you how many people you need to go and sample. So for example, this is the sample size calculator. There were 6,000 tenants, so the population of 6,000. They wanted to be using what's called a confidence interval of 3. So if the results came back saying we're 83% of the tenants are happy, they wanted to be confident that it was within the range 80 to 86. So you put a confidence interval in, you click the calculate button, and it tells you that you need a sample size of 906 tenants. So what they then did was set up a sample for 75 tenants a month to get valid data. And that enables you to say, if, for example, the tenants are coming back and saying 83% are happy, you can be 95% confident that the result actually lies between 80 and 86%. So if you know the total size of the population, you know how confident you want to be with your results, you can then work out exactly how many people you need to go and interview or get surveys back from. And you can also work it the other way around. So you can pick a sample size. If we got surveys back from 900 people and we know there's 6,000 beneficiaries in total, what would the confidence interval be? And if you pick a really small sample size, you'll have a really wide confidence interval and you won't have much useful data coming out of it. So just the web link will be in the slides if you've not managed to scribble that down. Free, bang your numbers in and it help you decide how many samples what sample size you need if you're doing surveys or interviews or just gathering feedback from beneficiaries. Move into just final slide or two for the workshop this morning before we open it up for Q&A. One of my other favorite quotes: if you wait for the perfect set of data, you'll be waiting a very long time. So you have to be pragmatic about this stuff, and sometimes it's good enough. You do need to understand about population distributions, you do need to think about sample sizes, but actually waiting for the perfect set of data, you're going to be waiting a very long time. And in terms of drawing conclusions and making decisions, you also, as you discovered with my aeroplane flying around a square, you have to be very careful with your first responses to what the data is telling you. This is a really well-known example from the Second World War. In order to decide where extra protection should be added to bombers, the RAF collected data on where bullets had penetrated the returning aircraft. The question is, where do you put the additional protection on the aircraft? Where do you put the extra protection? Anybody? So you don't trust me after all those exercises so far. Shona's shaking her head there.
Did you put it on the tail and the wings?
So where we've got all these red splodges.
As opposed to the body.
As opposed to the body, yeah. So Sam's put anywhere where it might hit the crew. Yes. So this is a really interesting data set, isn't it? Because the data set that's missing is the aeroplanes that didn't come back. And the aeroplanes that didn't come back probably didn't come back because they were hit there, there, or there. So it's really easy to be misled by the data. Potentially, you need to think about what's going on and you need to think about what data is missing. There was another really good example from the First World War. Soldiers were getting killed with head injuries, bullets to the head, obviously instant fatalities. They developed a new type of helmet, and they suddenly started receiving reports of more hospital admissions for head injuries. And they started worrying about, had we got the helmet design wrong? They hadn't. They were getting head injuries coming to hospital because the helmets were working. Previously, they weren't going to hospital because they were dead. So, think about what the data is not telling you as well as what the data is telling you. And I think I'm going to wrap up at that point and throw it open for a Q&A. There are other tools and techniques that you'll see in the handout when I get Angela to share those with you, things about sort of smoothing of trend lines if you've got seasonality in your data. But for the purposes of this morning, I think I pretty much want to wrap up at that point and really just throw it open for Q&A in the last 10 or 12 minutes. Thank you for your engagement, even if you felt it was painful at points through the workshop this morning. And maybe we should have said bring a calculator, Angela. I'm going to shut up at that point and hand over to Angela to do a MC Q&A session.
Great, thank you very much, Ian. So now's your chance to ask any questions, any questions you have about the slides, anything that Ian's covered, anything to do with your own organizations, anything you want to clarify.